The ancient seers of India predicted the exact moment the gods would leave the earth and disappear from it, and the exact moment they would return, not in vague symbols, not in poetry that could mean anything, in a precise, calculated timeline written thousands of years ago that describes the world you are living in right now with an accuracy that is difficult to explain. But here is the detail most people miss. They didn't just predict the darkness, they predicted what comes after it. They called the Dark Age Kali Yuga, an age where the secret becomes performance, where wisdom becomes product, where human beings forget something so deep they no longer remember what was lost, or that anything was lost at all. And they said it ends, not slowly, not quietly, but all at once, like something breaking after being held for too long. Tonight, we reach the part of this story most people never hear, because most never look that far. Buried inside the oldest spiritual tradition on earth is a prophecy so specific, so strange, and so uncomfortably relevant to this exact moment that once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear it, because parts of it may already be happening right now. Chapter 1: The Age You Were Born Into, and what that means. You were born into a broken age. Not broken in the way that wars break things, or floods, or the collapse of economies. Broken at a deeper level. At the level of something you cannot see or measure or point to directly, but that you have felt at some point without being able to name it. The feeling that something is missing. Not something you personally lost, something the world lost, long before you arrived. So long ago that no living person remembers when it was whole. So long ago that most people have stopped feeling the absence altogether and started calling the broken state normal. The ancient texts of India had a name for this state. They called it Kali Yuga. And what they wrote about it, thousands of years before any of us were born, is the reason we are here tonight. Here is something most people don't know about Kali Yuga. It is not just a spiritual concept. It is a precise cosmological measurement, a specific position in a cycle of time so vast that the human mind can barely hold its dimensions. The Vedic tradition divides cosmic time into 4 great ages, the 4 Yugas. And each age has a specific length, a specific quality, and a specific relationship between the human world and the divine. Satya Yuga, the age of truth, the longest, the most luminous. The age when the gods walked the earth and the distance between the human and the divine was no greater than the distance between a child and its parent. Not a metaphor. The gods were present in the way the sun is present, not a belief, not a practice, not a doctrine requiring faith, a daily, undeniable, ordinary reality. Treta Yuga, the age of the 3 sacred fires, when the gods began to step back, just slightly, not in anger, not as punishment, the way light retreats from a room when a window slowly closes, when ritual was born, because for the first time, direct contact with the divine required effort, required intention, required the deliberate turning of attention towards something that had previously been impossible to ignore. Dvapara Yuga, the age of the divide, when 2 of the 4 pillars of Dharma had already crumbled. when the gods appeared only to the most refined, the most prepared, the most disciplined of human beings. When the ordinary person could no longer count on that contact, could only receive second-hand accounts of what the extraordinary ones had seen, could only trust the transmission, could only believe. And then, Kali Yuga, the fourth age, the last age, the age of the single remaining pillar and the relentless pressure against even that. This is the age you were born into. But here is where it becomes strange. The Vedic texts do not describe Kali Yuga in the language of catastrophe. They do not describe fire from the sky, or the earth splitting open, or divine punishment raining down on a corrupted world. They describe something far more unsettling. They describe an ordinary world. A world that looks functional, that has cities and roads and systems of governance and enormous quantities of information moving between people at speeds the ancient world could not have imagined. A world in which, on the surface, everything appears to be working. And yet, underneath the surface, something is deeply, structurally wrong. The Bhagavad Purana describes Kali Yuga not as a sudden rupture, but as a slow contamination. Like a dye dropped into clear water. You do not see it immediately. The water seems fine, but grain by grain, molecule by molecule, the clarity disappears. And one morning, you look at the water and realize you can no longer see the bottom. And then you realize you stopped trying to see the bottom a long time ago. And then, most terrifying of all, you realize you have forgotten there ever was a bottom. What are the signs? This is where the ancient texts become uncomfortable, because they do not describe signs that belong to some distant future. They describe signs that surround us right now, in the world we move through every single day. The Bhagavad Purana lists them with the calm precision of a physician who has seen this illness before, who knows exactly what it looks like, who is not surprised, who is simply, accurately, describing what is there. The first sign: wealth becomes the measure of a man. Not wisdom, not character, not the quality of what he has understood through a life of genuine inquiry into what actually matters. What he owns, what he controls, what he can display. A man with an empty mind and a full account is considered more successful than a man with a full mind and an empty account. This is not an observation about modern capitalism. This is a 5,000-year-old prediction that reads like a description of something you saw this morning. The second sign: religious practice becomes performance. The outer forms remain. The temples are built larger and more elaborate than in any previous age. The ceremonies are conducted with great spectacle. The sacred words are still spoken, broadcast now to millions simultaneously. But the living understanding behind them has evaporated. What remains is the shell, the ritual without the fire inside it, the prayer spoken by a mouth whose mind is elsewhere, the pilgrimage made for the photograph rather than the encounter. And then this one. And this is the sign that should make any honest person stop and sit very still for a moment. Teachers sell their knowledge, not share it, not transmit it in the ancient sense, that living, direct transmission from one mind that has genuinely touched something real to another mind that is genuinely seeking it, in a relationship of complete trust and complete devotion. They sell it. It becomes a product with a price tag and a refund policy. And the student, in turn, is not seeking genuine transformation. They are purchasing credentials, purchasing the appearance of understanding without the inconvenience of actual understanding. Read that again slowly, because the ancient seers wrote this down thousands of years before the modern university was invented, thousands of years before the self-help industry existed, thousands of years before anyone had thought to charge money for the transmission of sacred knowledge. They saw it coming. They described it precisely, and they encoded it in a text that has survived long enough to be read by the people living inside the reality it predicted. But there is one more sign, and this is the one most people never hear. The Vishnu Purana says that in Kali Yuga, human beings will lose the ability to recognize the sacred, not lose interest in it, not choose to reject it, not decide through a process of rational deliberation that the sacred is not worth pursuing. Lose the ability, as if a sensory organ, the one through which the divine was perceived, the one that the ancient tradition knew how to develop and refine through specific practices over a lifetime, quietly atrophies, goes dormant, the way a muscle atrophies when it is never used. Not injured, not destroyed, simply no longer exercised, no longer needed, no longer remembered. And the person carrying that atrophied capacity goes about their life with no awareness that anything is missing, because the organ was already failing when they were born, because their parents had already lost the use of it, because their grandparents had already begun to lose it, because the culture around them, the language around them, the values and assumptions and daily textures of their world, none of it contains any reference to what the organ was for, any more than a person born blind from birth grieves the absence of color. You cannot miss what you have no framework to imagine. This is not a moral judgment. This is important to understand clearly. The Vedic tradition is careful about that. Kali Yuga is not punishment for human wickedness. It is not the consequence of specific choices that could have been avoided if only people had been wiser or more disciplined or more devoted. It is a season, a very long, very dark season in the breathing of cosmic time. And like all seasons, it follows the previous one and precedes the next one, regardless of what the beings living through it deserve. The winter is not punishing the flowers for dying. The winter is simply winter. Now, here is the part of this story where it becomes personal. Because if everything the ancient seers described about Kali Yuga is recognizable, if you look at those signs and feel, somewhere in your chest, the specific discomfort of recognition, then the question is not whether we are inside it. We are inside it. That much is clear. The question is, how far in are we? And this is where the ancient texts reveal something that most people, even within the Vedic tradition, have never fully sat with. Something that changes the entire shape of the story, depending on how you read it. The Vedic calculation of Kali Yuga's total length is 432,000 years. 432,000 years. At first, this number seems to close the conversation entirely. By the traditional reckoning, Kali Yuga began approximately 5,000 years ago, on the day Krishna left the earth, which the Mahabharata dates to around 3102 BCE, which means, by the mainstream calculation, we have approximately 427,000 years of Kali Yuga still ahead of us. Most people who encounter that number put down the text and walk away. They feel the weight of 427,000 years settle on their shoulders like a stone too heavy to carry, and they return to their ordinary life with a new and not entirely useful piece of information: that the darkness is essentially permanent, on any timescale that human beings can meaningfully inhabit. But wait, because there is another school of thought within the Vedic tradition, one that does not receive the same attention as the mainstream reckoning, one that has existed quietly within certain lineages for as long as anyone can trace, preserved not in the popular retellings, but in the more careful, more technical, more deliberately obscure layers of the tradition. And this school suggests something very different. It suggests that the traditional numbers are not literal years. They are ratios, symbolic proportions that encode a real timeline in a compressed mathematical language, designed to be decoded only when the world was ready for what the decoding revealed. When that encoding is unwrapped, when the numbers are read through the interpretive framework that these traditions have preserved, the timeline that emerges is startling. It places the end of Kali Yuga not hundreds of thousands of years away, not in a future that no human being alive can meaningfully relate to, but within a range that begins to feel uncomfortably, precisely, like the era we are moving through right now. One of the clearest voices on this question is Sri Yukteswar Giri, the Indian saint and scholar whose 1894 work, The Holy Science, applied a specific interpretive lens to the Vedic timeline and arrived at a calculation that sent quiet shockwaves through certain circles of the tradition. Sri Yukteswar argued that the yugas operate in a much shorter cycle, approximately 24,000 years for the full rotation through all four ages. By his reckoning, Kali Yuga in its descending phase ended around 500 CE, and the ascending phase, the slow movement back toward the light, began quietly, almost imperceptibly, around that same period, meaning that we are not deep inside the darkness, we are at the far edge of it, at the place where the wheel, having reached its lowest point, has already begun, slowly, imperceptibly at first, and then all at once, to turn back upward. Sri Yukteswar was not alone. His interpretation is not an outlier invented by one man to offer comfort. It is embedded in specific strands of the Puranic tradition itself, in passages that describe the signs of Kali Yuga's ending with the same precision that other passages describe its beginning. And those signs are where this story becomes something you cannot comfortably put back on the shelf. Because the signs of Kali Yuga's ending do not look like a recovery. Not at first. They look like an intensification. The ancient texts say this explicitly, and this is the detail most people never reach. Before the age completes its turn, everything it represents will reach its maximum expression. The confusion will be most total. The forgetting will be most complete. The distance between the human world and the divine will be at its greatest, so vast that many people will not merely have forgotten the divine, but will have concluded rationally and with considerable evidence that the divine never existed in the first place. Sound familiar? And then, in that maximum darkness, something appears. Not gradually, not as a slow warming. The texts are very specific about this. like something breaking after being held for too long. What appears, what the entire architecture of the Vedic cosmological timeline has been building toward, is the subject of everything ahead. But before we go there, I want you to carry something with you from this chapter. You were born into a broken age. Every human being alive right now was born into a broken age. Every person who has lived for the last several thousand years was born into a broken age. Every single one of them who ever felt that inexplicable absence, that sense of something missing that they could never quite name, could never quite locate, could never quite explain to anyone without sounding like they were describing a dream, was feeling the same structural gap, the same distance from a source that had been, for the vast majority of human history on this earth, as near as the air. You are not uniquely lost. You are not specially broken. You are not failing at something that others are succeeding at. You are living in a season. And the ancient seers, those extraordinary minds who saw across the curve of time with a clarity we can barely imagine from inside the fog they were describing. They saw this season. They mapped it. They named every symptom. They predicted every sign. And then they wrote past it into what comes after. And what comes after, what they saw waiting on the other side of this particular darkness. That is what most people never hear. That is exactly where we go next. Chapter 2. The Timeline. When it started, where we are, and what comes next. There is a date encoded in the Mahabharata, not hidden, not encrypted, written plainly, preserved across thousands of years of continuous transmission, confirmed by multiple independent astronomical calculations that modern scholars have verified using the positions of the stars described in the text itself. The date is February 17th, 3102 BCE. That is the day the Mahabharata says Kali Yuga began. Not a symbolic beginning, not an approximate era. A specific day, identifiable, calculable, cross-referenced against the position of the planets as described in the Surya Siddhanta, one of the oldest astronomical texts in the world. Modern astronomers who have run the calculations backward have confirmed that the planetary alignment described in the ancient texts did, in fact, occur on approximately that date. The ancient seers were not guessing. And here is what makes that date remarkable. The Mahabharata does not say Kali Yuga began because of the war at Kurukshetra. It does not say Kali Yuga began because human beings had accumulated too much sin, or because the gods grew tired of the world's imperfection, or because some invisible cosmic threshold was crossed through the slow deterioration of human virtue. It says Kali Yuga began on the day Krishna left the earth. One day he was here, the next day he was not, and the age changed. Not gradually, not over centuries of slow deterioration. The morning after his departure, the Mahabharata says, was already a different kind of morning. The light was the same light, the rivers ran in the same channels, the cities stood in the same positions, the people woke and went about what appeared to be their ordinary lives. But something, some quality that had saturated the very air of the world for as long as anyone living could remember, was absent, not diminished, not reduced, gone. Like the warmth that leaves a room not when someone closes a window, but when someone who is sitting in it stands and walks away. And the world that woke up that morning is the world we are still living in, 5,000 years later. The same absence, the same room, the same quality of a warmth that was here once, and that the walls still faintly remember. Now, the mainstream Vedic calculation assigns Kali Yuga a total length of 432,000 years. We have been in it for approximately 5,126 years. By that reckoning, we have 426,874 years remaining. Most people stop here. As we discussed in the previous chapter, most people encounter that number and feel its weight settle on them like a verdict, and return to their lives carrying a new and not particularly useful piece of information: that the darkness is essentially permanent, that 5,000 years is not even 1% of the total duration, that the wheel has barely moved from the bottom. But here is what most people do not know. That number, 432,000, is not arbitrary. It is not a round figure chosen for simplicity or for the comfort of religious tradition. It is part of an extraordinary mathematical system embedded throughout the Vedic cosmological texts with a precision that has fascinated astronomers, mathematicians, and scholars of ancient knowledge for centuries. 432,000 is exactly 40 times 10,800, the number of muhurtas, sacred time units in a single year in the Vedic calendar. It is exactly 60 times 7,200, a number that appears repeatedly in ancient astronomical calculations across cultures as distant from each other as the Maya and the Babylonians. It relates directly to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow, majestic wobble of the Earth's axis that completes one full cycle in approximately 25,920 years. Divide 432,000 by 25,920, and you get a ratio of almost exactly 1 to 60. A number of deep significance in the sexagesimal mathematical system that underlies both Vedic astronomy and the ancient Babylonian measurement of time. The number is a key. It belongs to a system. It is encoded, not invented. And keys exist because there is something to unlock. The question that certain scholars and certain lineages within the tradition have been asking quietly, persistently, for a very long time is this: what if the 432,000-year figure is not the duration of a single Kali Yuga, but the duration of a much larger cycle within which the yugas rotate many times? What if the enormous number is the full cycle, and the individual yugas within it are proportionally smaller, fractions of that vast rotation rather than its full length? What if, in other words, we have been misreading the scale? Sri Yukteswar Giri, the Indian saint, astronomer, and scholar whose 1894 work, The Holy Science, presented one of the most careful and most coherent alternative readings of the Vedic timeline ever written, made a specific and rigorously argued case for exactly this. He was not a fringe thinker or a casual interpreter. He was a man of deep traditional learning who had also absorbed the astronomical knowledge of the modern West, and who applied both simultaneously to the problem of the Yuga timeline, with results that sent quiet shockwaves through certain circles of the tradition and have not been satisfactorily refuted since. Sri Yukteswar proposed that the yugas operate in a cycle of approximately 24,000 years, 12,000 years descending, moving from Satya Yuga through Treta, Dvapara, and finally Kali, each age shorter and darker than the one before it, and 12,000 years ascending,
moving back from Kali through Dvapara, Treta, and finally Satya again, each age longer and more luminous than the one it follows. The descent is the exhale, the ascent is the inhale.
The full breath, 24,000 years, corresponds with remarkable precision to the astronomical cycle of the equinoxes. Our solar system, Sri Yukteswar argued, moves in a great orbit around the companion point in the galaxy. And as it moves closer to that center of cosmic intelligence, the quality of consciousness available to beings on Earth increases. As it moves away, it decreases. The Yugas are not an arbitrary religious calendar. They are a description of what actually happens to consciousness when the Earth's relationship to the broader cosmos changes. By Sri Yukteswar's calculation, the descending Kali Yuga lasted from approximately 11,501 BCE to 499 CE. We then enter an ascending Kali Yuga, a period of very slow, very difficult, but genuine improvement in the quality of human consciousness. And around 1699 CE, we crossed the threshold into the ascending Dvapara Yuga, a period of genuine and measurable acceleration, of expanding capacity, of the slow return of abilities and sensitivities that the long descent had buried. Which means, by this reading, we are not 5,000 years into a 432,000-year darkness with no end visible from any human timescale. We are more than 300 years into a 4,800-year awakening. Sit with that for a moment. Let the shape of it land. Is Sri Yukteswar right? This is where honesty requires a pause. The tradition itself does not speak with one voice on this question. The mainstream reckoning, 432,000 years, has the weight of the most widely accepted Puranic sources behind it, and scholars who defend it are not speaking carelessly. Their arguments are serious. Their sources are ancient and authoritative. Sri Yukteswar's reading is a minority position within the tradition. However internally consistent, however carefully argued, however compellingly it maps onto astronomical reality. But here is what is not in dispute, and what matters most for tonight. The signs of Kali Yuga's intensification that the ancient texts describe. The total confusion, the maximum forgetting, the complete inversion of all values, the moment when wisdom looks like ignorance, and ignorance looks like sophistication. These signs are here, clearly, undeniably, recognizably here. Anyone paying attention can see them. Anyone honest with themselves has felt them. And the signs that certain passages of the Vedic texts associate with the turning of the age, the beginnings of a new quality of hunger for the sacred that survives even within a culture with no framework for it. A new urgency about questions that previous generations had stopped asking. A strange and growing sense among certain people that the world they were told was normal is not, in fact, normal. Those signs are also here. At the same time, two things true simultaneously. The darkness at its most intense, and something else, underneath it, beginning to move. The Linga Purana describes the final phase of Kali Yuga with a detail that makes most people deeply uncomfortable. It says, The final phase will look worse than everything before it. Not because it is worse in the ultimate sense, not because the age is somehow deepening into something beyond its own nature, but because darkness, when it is truly ending, does not fade gently. It concentrates, it intensifies, it becomes most visible, most aggressive, most total, precisely at the moment it is most threatened. Think of a fire that is dying, truly dying, the last stages, the final minutes before it goes completely dark. It sometimes flares, briefly, suddenly, more intensely than it burned in the steady middle of its life. A last brilliance. And then the darkness that follows is more complete than any darkness during the fire's burning. But it is the darkness of aftermath, of completion, not of continuation. The Linga Purana says this explicitly. In the final phase of Kali Yuga, people who carry ancient truth will be ridiculed. Those who remember something real will be dismissed as primitive, as deluded, as obstacles to the rational progress that the age has convinced itself it represents. The inversion of values will be so total that the ones who are most lost will appear most confident, and the ones who have found something genuine will appear most uncertain. Because genuine understanding always makes a person humble. And Kali Yuga mistakes humility for weakness. But here is what the same texts add immediately after. And this is the part that most readings of Kali Yuga leave out entirely. They say, this final phase is also the phase of maximum spiritual possibility. Because the darkness has thinned something, not cleared it, thinned it. The contrast has become so extreme, so impossible to rationalize away, that certain human beings, positioned at exactly this juncture, alive at exactly this crossing point, will feel the absence of the sacred not as a vague philosophical concern, but as a physical urgency, as hunger. And hunger, the Bhagavata Purana says, in this particular age, opens a door that comfort in any earlier age could never have opened. Because when everything that normally substitutes for the sacred has been tried and found empty, and when the culture around you offers nothing but more refined versions of the same emptiness, the reaching that remains is of a different quality than the reaching that happened in ages when the sacred was simply present, available, unremarkable, as ordinary as the morning. That reaching, that specific quality of effort made in maximum darkness, against maximum resistance, without the support of a culture that understands what you are reaching for, produces something the sages of Satya Yuga never had the opportunity to develop. Something earned, something tested, something that belongs to you in a way that freely given gifts never quite do. The Vishnu Purana uses a specific word for the transition between Kali Yuga and what follows it. The word is Sandhya, twilight, not the darkness, not the dawn, the threshold, the in-between, the moment when the sky holds both simultaneously. When it is genuinely impossible to say, standing at the window, whether the night is ending or the day has not yet begun. And the Vishnu Purana says this transition is not an instant, it is a period during which both qualities, the darkness of Kali and the first light of what follows, exist in the world at the same time. Underground, in seeds, in individuals who feel the new light without being able to explain it, in moments of clarity that arrive without warning, in the hunger that the darkness itself creates. We are in the Sandhya, not at its beginning, well into it. The darkness still real, still pressing, still doing everything that Kali Yuga does. And yet, something else present beneath it, rising the way water rises through soil before it becomes visible at the surface. Not visible yet to everyone, not even to most, but felt. By those who are paying the right kind of attention, by those who have not yet filled the silence with everything the age provides to fill it with, by those who still know the difference between noise and emptiness, and who know in their deepest place that the emptiness is not empty at all. It is full of something the age has no name for, something that is about to have one. Chapter 3. What the Siddhas saw, the signs of the ending age. There is a Tamil text that almost no one outside of South India has read. It was composed by a Siddha, one of the extraordinary adepts of the Tamil spiritual tradition. Beings who had refined themselves to a degree that gave them, the tradition holds, direct perception of past and future in the way ordinary people perceive the present. Not prophecy in the vague, poetic, could mean anything sense. Precise observation of a timeline that their expanded perception made as readable as a map spread open under clear light. The text is called the Siva Vakyam, and in it, the Siddha who composed it describes a future age in which people will be surrounded by more information than any previous civilization ever possessed, and will understand less than any previous civilization ever understood. He wrote this more than 1,000 years ago. He was describing the world you woke up in this morning. And here is what makes that detail so difficult to dismiss. He was not alone. Not speaking from a single tradition, not confined to a single era, not drawing from a single source. Across the vast body of Vedic, Puranic, Tantric, and Siddha literature, across texts composed in different centuries, in different languages, by different practitioners working in different lineages with different methods, the same picture emerges. Described from different angles in different vocabularies with different emphases, but recognizably the same picture. Our world, our time, our specific position in the great cycle. This is where the ancient predictions stop feeling like mythology and start feeling like something else entirely. The Bhagavata Purana gives a list of the signs of Kali Yuga's intensification. It is not a long list. It does not need to be. Each entry is precise. Each entry lands, if you let it arrive fully rather than deflecting it with the comfortable rationalization that this is just how all ages feel, that every generation thinks its own time is uniquely dark. Each entry lands like a finger pressed with deliberate care against a bruise. When people migrate from place to place, driven purely by economic advantage, with no attachment to the land of their origin, no connection to the traditions of their ancestors, no relationship to the specific sacred geography that shaped the consciousness of their people across hundreds of generations. This is a sign. Not because movement is wrong, not because the Vedic tradition idealizes a static, rooted world, but because the particular quality of this movement, driven not by discovery or devotion, or the expansion of understanding, but purely by the calculus of material advantage, represents a specific kind of severing. a cutting of threads, a loss of the vertical dimension of a life, the dimension that connects a person not just to the horizontal network of contemporary relationships, but to the depth of what came before, to the accumulated understanding of all the lives that shape the specific piece of earth they are leaving behind. When children no longer respect their parents, not as a temporary rebellion, not as the natural friction of young minds asserting their independence, but as a permanent, structurally embedded cultural condition in which the accumulated wisdom of a human life, the specific and hard-won understanding that comes only from having actually lived through things, is considered categorically less valuable than the immediate, unearned confidence of youth. When rainfall becomes unpredictable, when the seasons lose their rhythm, when the earth itself, which in earlier ages responded to the quality of consciousness of the beings living upon it, which was understood by every ancient agricultural tradition in the world to be in active, responsive relationship with human awareness, begins to behave as though something fundamental in that relationship has been permanently disrupted. And then this one. This is the sign most people pass over quickly, because sitting with it fully requires a pause that is not comfortable. When people seek spiritual guidance from anyone who claims it, regardless of whether that person has actually touched anything real, when transmission becomes content, when the teacher with the largest audience is considered the most credible, when the sacred becomes a marketplace, where the primary qualification for offering is not depth of genuine understanding, but fluency in the language of whoever has the most to sell. The Bhagavad Purana wrote this down roughly 2,500 years ago, before the internet, before the self-help industry, before the influencer, before the online course and the wellness brand and the spiritual retreat priced at a level that ensures only the already comfortable can attend. The ancient seers were not clever critics of modernity. They were observers of a pattern so large that they could see its full shape from outside it. And what they saw, they described with the calm, clinical precision of beings for whom the darkness was not a tragedy, but a season they had mapped completely, a season they knew the length of. But here is what most readings of these signs miss entirely. And this is important. This changes everything about how you hear them. The ancient texts do not present these signs as causes of Kali Yuga's darkness. They present them as symptoms. There is a difference so fundamental that getting it wrong distorts everything that follows. A cause can be addressed. If specific human choices are producing the suffering of an age, then different choices could, in principle, prevent it. The moral framework that follows from cause is responsibility and repair. A symptom points toward something deeper, something structural, something that cannot be resolved by trying harder at the level at which the symptom appears. You cannot cure a fever by lowering the number on the thermometer. The number is information, not the problem. The Vedic tradition is completely clear about this distinction. The signs of Kali Yuga are not things happening to a world that could have been otherwise with better human choices. They are what a world looks like when the cosmic cycle has reached this specific position. When the distance from the source is at its maximum, when the signal from the divine is at its faintest, and the noise of material reality is at its loudest. This does not mean that individual human choices are irrelevant. They are enormously relevant. More relevant in this age, some texts suggest, than in any previous one, precisely because the effort required is greater, and therefore the quality of what is cultivated through that effort is different. But the signs themselves, the signs should be read not with guilt, not with the particular exhausting weight of feeling personally responsible for the condition of an age, but with recognition. Recognition is not defeat. Recognition is orientation. The navigator who knows exactly where the rocks are is not in greater danger than the one who does not. The navigator who knows exactly where the rocks are is the one with a chance of finding the passage through. The Tamil Siddhas were particularly direct about the specific texture of the age's ending, more direct, in many ways, than the Puranic tradition. Less interested in the cosmological framework, more interested in the precise phenomenology of what a person living inside the age would feel. Tirumular, whose Tirumantiram is one of the foundational texts of the entire Shaiva Siddhanta tradition, wrote about the current age with a specificity that makes it almost impossible to read as description of anything other than the world we currently inhabit. He described a time when people would worship the body as the self. Not use the body, worship it. Would mistake the container for what is contained.
Would organize the entire project of a human life around the maintenance, the optimization, the display, and the continuous gratification of a physical form that the ancient tradition understood as, at most, the outermost of several layers of what a human being actually is. He described a time when sound would be so constant, so pervasive, so total in its occupation of every available moment and surface, that the interior silence, the specific quality of quiet that the tradition understood as the primary site of encounter with the divine, would become not merely difficult to reach, but genuinely unrecognizable to people who had never experienced it, who had been born into the noise, who had no framework for understanding what silence was for. Not the silence of empty space, the silence of presence, the silence that is not the absence of noise, but the active presence of something deeper than noise, something that noise, in sufficient quantity and sufficient constancy, renders first inaccessible and then unimaginable. This is not lamentation. The tradition is insistent about that. Tirumular was not grieving. He was mapping, describing the terrain so that the traveler moving through it would know what they were moving through. And here is where the ancient predictions begin to move from description towards something more personally directed. The Srimad Bhagavatam describes what begins to stir inside the darkness before the darkness ends, not after the age completes its turn, inside it, while the confusion is still total and the forgetting still complete. It describes individuals, specific human beings scattered across the world without organizational connection, without shared doctrine or shared institution or even shared language, who begin independently to remember, not to study their way to understanding, not to learn their way there, not to practice their way there through years of disciplined effort, though practice and discipline are not excluded. To remember, as if something that was always present, always available, always broadcasting through the noise on a frequency the noise had covered, finds, in a particular person at a particular moment, a gap in the distraction,
a gap in the certainty of the age. A gap that opens not because the person is extraordinary, but because they became, for long enough, still. And through that gap, something enters. And when it enters, the person it enters is changed. Not dramatically, not in ways visible from the outside, structurally, at the level of perception. Something shifts in how they see the world, and once it has shifted, it cannot be shifted back. The tradition calls these people the Shishyas of the Sandhya, the students of twilight. And it says something about them that is one of the most precise observations in all the Vedic literature on this subject. It says they will feel, almost universally, that they arrived in the wrong time, that there is a gap, not psychological, not a disorder, not a personal failing requiring treatment, but a genuine structural mismatch between who they are and the age they inhabit. This feeling, the tradition says, is not confusion. It is recognition. These are beings whose inner orientation belongs to what is coming rather than to what is present, who carry, in the architecture of their perception, a template for a world that does not yet fully exist in external reality, but that the internal reality of certain human beings is already expressing. They are the Sandhya made human, holding the darkness and the first light simultaneously in the same body, usually feeling the weight of the former far more clearly than the warmth of the latter. The Siddha Agastya, whose tradition places him among the most ancient and most powerful of the Tamil adepts, whose presence the tradition traces across an almost incomprehensible span of time, left predictions about the end of the age that are preserved in what is called the Agastya Nadi, a collection of palm leaf manuscripts that certain practitioners in specific lineages of Tamil Nadu still consult today. Among his predictions, that a generation would arise that was simultaneously the most distracted and the most spiritually hungry in all of human history. That these two qualities, the maximum distraction and the maximum hunger, would exist in the same individuals at the same time. Not as contradiction, not as two separate populations, as the two faces of the same condition. The distraction and the hunger are not opposites, they are the same thing. The distraction is what the hunger looks like from outside. The hunger is what the distraction feels like from inside. And that hunger, the specific, unnamed, inarticulate ache of a being who has tried everything the age offers and found it insufficient, is not a sign of personal failure. It is a sign of readiness, of a perception that has, somewhere in its depths, already exceeded what the age can contain, that is pressing, without knowing it, against the limit of what the darkness can offer, and beginning, slowly, without vocabulary, without map, to feel the presence of the wall it has been pressing against, and to wonder for the first time, what is on the other side? The signs of the ending age are not comfortable signs. They are not the signs of a world getting measurably better. They do not appear in headlines as hope. They do not trend as progress. They appear in the private experience of specific individuals who feel something shifting in the quality of their perception, without being able to explain it to anyone around them, without sounding either naive or unwell. The distraction and the hunger.
The noise at its ceiling. the feeling of having been born in the wrong time, the moments of clarity that arrive without warning and leave a mark that does not fade, and knowledge of something that cannot be unknown, that sits in the chest like an ember that the wind of ordinary life fans occasionally into brief, inexplicable warmth. These are the signs, not of a world descending further into darkness, of a world that has reached the wall, and of something on the other side of that wall that is, the ancient texts insist, with a consistency that spans thousands of years and dozens of traditions, about to come through it. What that something is, what the texts say it looks like, what it means for the world, and for the specific human beings alive at this specific crossing point. That is exactly where we go next. Chapter 4. Kalki. Who is coming and what it means. Every major spiritual tradition in the world contains a version of the same story. A figure who comes at the end of time, not to judge, not to reward the faithful and punish the wicked in the transactional way that popular religion tends to imagine, but to complete something, to close a cycle that has been open for longer than any human memory reaches, to do what only the end of an age can do, not repair the world that is ending, but clear the ground for the world that follows. In the Christian tradition, it is the return of Christ. In the Islamic tradition, it is the Mahdi, the rightly guided one, who will appear when the world has exhausted every false path and is finally ready, through that very exhaustion, to recognize the true one. In the Buddhist tradition, it is Maitreya, the future Buddha, the one who comes when the teachings of Shakyamuni have faded beyond recovery, and the world requires not a revival of the old lamp, but the lighting of a new one from the same eternal source. And in the Vedic tradition, the oldest of all these accounts, the most technically precise, the one that embedded its prophecy in the most elaborate and most carefully preserved cosmological framework of any civilization on Earth, it is Kalki, the 10th avatar of Vishnu, the final descent, the one the entire architecture of the Yuga cycle has been building toward, since the first moment the wheel began its long, slow, inevitable downward turn. Most people who know this name know only the outline. The white horse, the blazing sword, the arrival at the moment of maximum darkness. But the full account, preserved in the Kalki Purana and referenced across the broader Puranic tradition, is considerably more precise, considerably more layered, and considerably more directly relevant to the world we are moving through right now than the outline alone can possibly convey. Tonight, we go past the outline, into the interior of the prophecy, into the details that most people never reach. Let us begin with what most people get wrong. Most people who have encountered the name Kalki picture a warrior. This is understandable. The texts do describe him in martial terms. The Kalki Purana, the text devoted specifically to this avatar, the one that traces his origin, his birth, his nature, and his cosmic function with more careful detail than any other single source in the tradition, describes him arriving on a white horse, carrying a sword that blazes with the light of a comet, moving through the world of maximum Kali with a decisiveness that leaves no room for gradual transition or comfortable half measures. But here is what most people miss when they read those descriptions. The sword is not primarily a weapon of destruction. It is a weapon of clarity.
In the Vedic symbolic vocabulary, the sword that cuts through darkness does not kill. It distinguishes. It separates what is real from what has been mistaken for real.
What has genuine substance from what has been sustained only by the collective agreement of an age too confused to question its own most fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. The sword of Kalki is viveka, discrimination in the Sanskrit sense, applied not to a single mind working through its confusion in meditation, but to an entire civilization that has organized itself entirely around its confusion, that has built everything it values, everything it worships, everything it calls progress, on top of that confusion as its foundation. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what the texts are actually predicting. Because if you read Kalki as a figure of destruction, the prophecy becomes a catastrophe narrative. The end of the world, in the familiar apocalyptic form that human imagination gravitates toward when it tries to conceive of change at a scale too large for ordinary understanding. Fire, judgment, the dramatic overturning of physical reality by a force arriving from outside it. The story we already know by heart, because every tradition has told it in slightly different clothes across every century of the Dark Age. But if you read Kalki as a figure of clarity, as the principle of genuine, unobstructed seeing arriving at the moment of maximum confusion, the prophecy becomes something entirely different, something more precise, more applicable, more uncomfortably directly relevant to the specific people who are alive at this crossing point, in this twilight, in this particular hour of the great cycle that the ancient seers mapped and left behind for exactly this moment in time. The Kalki Purana describes the circumstances of his arrival with a specificity that rewards patient and careful attention. He will be born in a village called Shambhala. Shambhala, a name that has accumulated more mythology around it than perhaps any other single word in the entire Vedic and Buddhist traditions combined. The hidden kingdom of the Himalayas, the paradise beyond the northern mountains, the place that appears on no physical map and is reached by no ordinary traveler. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has its own elaborate account of Shambhala, a kingdom with kings and warriors, and its own internal spiritual hierarchy spanning many generations. The theosophical tradition of the 19th century built an entire cosmology around it. Popular imagination has made it synonymous with the permanently unattainable, the kind of sacred geography that exists in another dimension of reality rather than in the physical space that ordinary maps can capture. But here is what the Kalki Purana itself actually says about Shambhala. The detail the popular mythology almost universally overlooks. It says Shambhala is a village, not a hidden kingdom, not a cosmic realm accessible only through decades of extraordinary inner preparation. A village, a specific, geographically located, physically existing place where a child will be born to parents whose names the text provides: Vishnu Yasha and Sumati, whose lineage the text traces with care, whose childhood the text describes in terms that are, by the elaborate and usually cosmic standards of Puranic literature, remarkably, almost pointedly, ordinary. The avatar comes not in a blaze of cosmic fire, but in a cradle, in a family, in a place, in the most human of all possible forms, as it has always come,
because the divine does not impose itself on the human world from outside. It enters through the human, through the specific, the embodied, the particular. Through a body that is born, that grows, that carries its divine nature inside an ordinary human life, the way a river carries the ocean inside every drop of its water. Present always, recognizable only to those who know what they are looking at. There is one more detail about Shambhala that most accounts never mention.
Because it changes the nature of what we understand ourselves to be waiting for. The Kalki Purana does not describe Shambhala as a place of visible sacred power or obvious spiritual distinction. It describes it as ordinary, a place where the sacred is present not because it announces itself, but because it has never entirely left. A place that maintained through the full duration of the Dark Age some thread of genuine practice, some continuity of real transmission, invisible from outside, but instantly recognizable to a divine intelligence looking for a point of entry into the world. The way a river finds the softened stone, not through force, but through recognition. This is the tradition's clearest statement about where the sacred actually survives in Kali Yuga. Not in the largest temples, not in the most celebrated lineages, in the ordinary places that kept the fire small enough that no one thought to put it out. What does Kalki do when he arrives? He rides, he sees, he restores. He moves through the world at the end of Kali Yuga and encounters the specific condition of a world at its maximum distance from the divine. And he does not condemn it, does not rage at the confusion or the forgetting or the total inversion of every value that once sustained the sacred, does not punish the beings who were born inside the fog and spend their entire lives without a map to lead them out of it. He simply sees it clearly, without distortion, without the fog that surrounds every being born inside the age and raised entirely within its assumptions. And in seeing it clearly, he ends it, because Kali Yuga, at its deepest root, is a condition of unclear seeing, a condition in which the fundamental nature of reality is so thoroughly obscured by noise, by accumulated desire, by the compounded weight of generations of practiced and inherited forgetting, that the obscuration itself has become invisible. The fog is so constant that people have stopped noticing they live in fog, have built entire civilizations inside the fog, have called those civilizations the pinnacle of what human intelligence can achieve, have called the fog clarity. When that fog is penetrated, suddenly, completely, by a quality of seeing that belongs to a consciousness standing entirely outside the conditions that produced it, the age ends. Not because physical reality is destroyed, because the misperception that sustained it is corrected. This is not a comfortable description of apocalypse. It is a precise description of awakening applied at the full scale of an entire age. The Kalki Purana contains a detail most commentators pass over quickly, something that does not fit comfortably into the simple narrative of the all-powerful avatar arriving to fix what helpless human beings have broken. It describes what the world must look like before Kalki can arrive, not the external signs of his coming, the specific internal condition the world must reach before the principle he represents can enter it.
And that condition is not simply more darkness or more deterioration. The world must reach the point where the last genuine old knowledge has been reduced to its most compressed and most hidden form, where the transmission chains, those sacred lineages of teacher and student through which the understanding of earlier ages was preserved and carried forward, have narrowed to their absolute minimum. The seed must still exist, but held by the fewest possible people, understood by even fewer, barely audible above the noise, but alive. And this is where Parashurama reappears, the sixth avatar of Vishnu, the warrior sage who withdrew to the mountains at the end of his own age, who has been sitting there in austerity, in absolute stillness, performing tapas of a duration and intensity that no human tradition has adequate language to describe, since before Kali Yuga fully descended.
He has been waiting for this precise moment for longer than any currently living civilization has existed. Think about what that means. An immortal being, sitting in complete stillness, holding the full weight of an ancient knowledge intact, not as text, not as doctrine, but as living understanding, through every decade and every century of the Dark Age, not diminishing, not forgetting, simply waiting with the absolute patience of something that does not age and cannot be worn down by time, for the morning it was placed there to meet. The Kalki Purana says Parashurama will emerge from his Himalayan retreat when Kalki comes, will present himself as teacher, will give the 10th avatar everything he has preserved, all the knowledge kept perfectly intact, without distortion, without the gradual degradation that affects every transmission carried through ordinary mortal chains, across every century of the Dark Age, through every generation of the forgetting, through the full, unbroken, patient duration of the noise. The transmission chain did not break. It narrowed to a single immortal thread. And that thread has been held with complete steadiness and complete patience through the longest night in the memory of this cycle, waiting for the morning that makes it finally possible to pass forward. Here is where this becomes personal. The Bhagavata Purana contains a passage rarely quoted in popular discussions, because it complicates the simple narrative of the powerful avatar descending to rescue a world that played no role in its own awakening. It says the arrival of Kalki is not separate from the inner awakening of certain human beings that precedes and accompanies it. That the quality of consciousness beginning to emerge right now in scattered individuals, in those students of the twilight we described in the previous chapter, is not merely a sign of what is coming, it is part of how it comes. The avatar does not descend into a world waiting passively for rescue. The avatar descends into a world that has prepared itself, in part, for the descent, that has developed, through the specific difficulty of the Dark Age, through the quality of effort required to reach toward the sacred in an age organized to prevent that reaching, a capacity that creates the conditions for the transmission to occur. This is the Vedic understanding of the divine-human relationship at its deepest level. The gods do not act unilaterally on a world that plays no role in its own awakening. The relationship is always, even at the scale of cosmic ages, reciprocal. The divine meets the human exactly at the level of the human's genuine reaching, no higher, no lower, exactly there. Which means the question embedded in the Kalki prophecy
directed at whoever is encountering it, in whatever age they inhabit, is not simply, when will Kalki come? The question is, are you part of the reaching that makes that coming possible? The Kalki Purana ends its account of this avatar with one final image. Into the world of maximum Kali, maximum confusion, maximum forgetting, the sacred reduced to performance, wisdom reduced to product, human beings so thoroughly identified with the surface of their experience that the depth has become, for most of them, not merely unreachable, but literally unimaginable. A white horse appears on the horizon. The white horse is the ancient symbol of solar intelligence, the quality of consciousness that moves like light, that cannot be stopped by any accumulated thickness of darkness, however long that darkness has been building, however completely it has covered the landscape beneath it. That arrives not through the gradual processes of ordinary causation, but through a directness that bypasses every obstacle between the source and its long-awaited destination. The rider carries a sword that blazes like a comet. And the first thing that sword touches, before any external corruption, before any restructuring of the physical or social or political world, before any visible transformation of the landscape of the age, is the fog in the mind of the being who is finally, genuinely, completely ready to see. The external transformation follows from the internal one, not the other way around. The end of Kali Yuga is not something that happens to the world from outside. It is something that happens in consciousness first. And then, as that clarity spreads outward from the point of its arrival, the way light spreads from the horizon in the minutes before sunrise, the world reorganizes itself around the change. Slowly at first, then faster, then all at once, like something breaking after being held for too long. Chapter 5. The moment of transition. What the texts say, it actually feels. No one alive today has witnessed the end of an age. This is worth stating plainly, because it shapes everything about how we understand what the ancient texts are describing when they speak of the turning point. Every human being alive right now was born inside Kali Yuga. Every human being who has lived for the last 5,000 years was born inside it. No living tradition carries the direct, first-hand experiential memory of what it looked, felt, or sounded like from the inside when an age completed its full turn and the next one began. We have only the descriptions left behind by those who saw it coming. And the descriptions, as we have been discovering throughout this series, are more specific than most people realize, more precise, more attentive to the particular texture of the actual experience, not just the cosmic mechanics, not just the theological framework, but the moment-by-moment quality of what happens to the world and to the people in it when the wheel crosses the threshold from one age into the next. Tonight we go into those descriptions, into the interior of the transition, into the part of this story that almost no one, even within the Vedic tradition itself, has fully absorbed or fully transmitted. The first thing the ancient texts say about the moment of transition is something that should, by now, feel familiar. Because we have been circling it since the beginning of this series, approaching it from different angles, through different traditions and different vocabularies, and different bodies of ancient knowledge. The transition does not begin in the external world. It begins in consciousness. This is the Vedic insistence that runs through every description of every Yuga transition in the entire tradition.
not as a philosophical preference, not as the spiritual bias of a culture that values inner life over outer life, but as a precise cosmological claim about the nature of causation itself. The quality of consciousness that inhabits a world is not a product of that world. It is its source. The world we perceive, the world we build, the world we collectively inhabit, this world is downstream of the quality of awareness that generates it. Always has been, in every age, at every scale. Change the awareness, and eventually, inevitably, the world changes. Not immediately, not at the speed of intention or effort or goodwill, or the sincere desire of specific individuals who understand what needs to happen. At the speed of a much larger process, the way a glacier changes a landscape, not in a single dramatic moment that anyone alive could witness beginning to end, but through the patient, relentless pressure of something enormous, moving in a direction it cannot be deflected from. The Yuga transition is the glacier reaching the sea. The Vishnu Purana describes the beginning of the new age with an image that is not the image most people would expect. It does not describe a sudden flooding of light across the darkened world. It does not describe the dramatic reversal of all the conditions of Kali Yuga in a single cosmic moment of total transformation. It describes something quieter, more biological, more like the way a new season announces itself in nature, not through a single event that can be dated and documented, but through the accumulation of small signals that, taken individually, seem like nothing, but that taken together constitute an unmistakable shift in the quality of the world, in the quality of what is possible within it. The rivers run clearer. This is the first sign the Vishnu Purana gives, not as metaphor, as a literal, physical description of what happens to the material world when the consciousness inhabiting it begins to realign with the cosmic order that sustains all living systems. The rivers run clearer because the relationship between human awareness and the natural world, a relationship that in Satya Yuga was one of active, conscious, mutually sustaining reciprocity, begins to restore itself. Tentatively at first, in specific places, then more broadly. The way circulation restores itself to a limb that has been asleep, with tingling, with the specific discomfort of returning sensation, before the warmth and ease of full function return. The crops come more easily. The soil recovers its generosity, not through improved agricultural technique or better management of resources, through the restoration of something the Vedic tradition understood as fundamental to the productivity of the earth, the quality of the consciousness living upon it. And then this one. People begin to remember their dreams. This is the detail worth sitting with, because in the Vedic understanding, the dream state is not the meaningless neurological byproduct that modern science tends to treat it as. It is a specific level of awareness, a level at which the individual mind, loosened from the tight grip of waking state identity, makes contact with dimensions of reality that the waking state cannot access. The capacity to remember dreams, to bring something back from that contact, to carry information across the threshold between sleep and waking, is, in this framework, a direct measure of the permeability of that threshold. In Kali Yuga, the threshold is thick, dense, nearly impermeable.
People sleep, people dream. But what happens in the dream does not cross back into waking life in any meaningful way. The contact is made and then lost, every night, without residue, without the specific quality of knowing that arrives when the membrane is thin enough to carry something through. In the New Age, the membrane thins. The threshold becomes permeable again. And the first sign, the Vishnu Purana says, is that people begin to remember what they encountered on the other side of it. The Srimad Bhagavatam describes the transition not as a single moment, but as a spectrum, as a range of experience that different people, depending on the specific quality and depth of their inner development, will encounter in entirely different ways. For most people, the transition will feel like a gradual change in the quality of the world, almost imperceptible at first, the way the change of seasons is almost imperceptible until one morning you walk outside and realize that the air is different, that something has shifted, that the world you are standing in is not quite the same world you were standing in a month ago, though you cannot point to any single change that accounts for the difference. A slow, diffuse brightening, a growing ease in certain things that always required effort, a faint but unmistakable sense that the resistance, that specific, pervasive, unnamed resistance that has been the background texture of every life lived inside Kali Yuga, so constant as to seem like the nature of reality itself, is beginning, almost imperceptibly, to ease. For a smaller number, those whose inner development has brought them to the edge of the threshold, those who have done the specific and difficult work of thinning the membrane through genuine and sustained practice of whatever their tradition has preserved, the experience of the transition will be different, more abrupt, more total, more like the description in the Kalki Purana of the sword touching the fog, a sudden, complete clarity that arrives without warning and restructures everything in its wake. Not comfortable. The Bhagavatam is honest about this. It does not describe the transition as a pleasant awakening into warmth and ease. It describes it as the experience of a very bright light arriving in a space that has been dark for a very long time, which is not initially comfortable, which requires real adjustment, which can feel, to a perceptual system conditioned to the dark over the full span of a life lived inside Kali Yuga, more like disruption than relief, at first. The Markandeya Purana, one of the 18 major Puranas, a text of great antiquity and unusual precision in its descriptions of cosmic transitions, says that the turning of the Yuga does not happen uniformly across the world. It happens in pockets. It begins in specific places with specific people in specific communities where the conditions for the New Age have been internally prepared, where the quality of consciousness required to receive the New Age has been cultivated, however imperfectly, however partially, against the full resistance of the Dark Age surrounding it.
And from those pockets, those nodes of early transition, those places where the new quality of consciousness has already begun to establish itself, it spreads, slowly, the way a new quality of light spreads from a lamp carried into a darkened room. The lamp does not force the darkness out. It simply establishes a new condition, and the darkness, which was never a positive presence but only the absence of light, recedes in proportion to the extent that the light fills the available space. Not because the darkness was defeated, because it was displaced, because there was no longer any space in the room that the light had not reached. This is how the Yuga changes, not everywhere at once, not in a single cosmic moment of universal transformation, through nodes, through pockets,
through the specific people and places and communities where the internal preparation has created the conditions for the new quality to take root and to hold. Each node connecting to the next, each individual clarity becoming available to the individuals nearest to it, not through argument or persuasion, but through the quality of what becomes possible in their presence. The way warmth spreads through a room from a single source without requiring any announcement of its arrival, which means the transition is already happening. Not everywhere, not for most people, not in ways that headline news or mainstream culture has the vocabulary to recognize or describe, but in pockets, in individuals, in moments of inexplicable clarity, in conversations where something in the air suddenly feels different, thinner, more permeable, more alive with the specific quality that the tradition associates with the presence of the sacred in its active and available form. The Devi Bhagavatam adds a dimension that no other Puranic source quite matches.
It says the Devi, the goddess, the feminine principle of the divine who distributed herself into the very fabric of the material world, rather than withdrawing when the other gods stepped back, is particularly active during transitions, during the moments when one quality of the world is giving way to another, during the threshold times, the sandhyas, the twilights. The Devi is the goddess of thresholds, of the in-between spaces, of the specific moment when what was is no longer fully present, and what will be is not yet fully arrived. In those moments, the Devi Bhagavatam says, her presence is most accessible. Not because she was absent before, she is never absent, but because the threshold state is precisely the state in which the membrane between the ordinary and the sacred is most permeable, when the kind of awareness required to encounter her is most naturally, most effortlessly available to a human being who has become quiet enough to receive it. This is why the great festivals of the goddess tradition are always at the junctions of the seasons. Navaratri, at the junction of autumn. The great worship at the moment when darkness is longest. Not arbitrary choices, not cultural convention accumulated without meaning. A map, a precise and carefully preserved map of when a membrane is thin, when the encounter is most possible, when the threshold is most open, when the reaching, if genuine, is most likely to find what it is reaching toward. And we are inside the longest junction there is, the transition between ages that the ancient texts described as lasting not for 9 days, but for centuries. The full span of a generation, and then another, and then another, each one born slightly closer to the morning than the last. We are inside it, moving through it, living our entire lives at the threshold. There is one final detail the ancient texts preserve about the transition that almost no discussion of this topic ever reaches. The Agni Purana says, the world does not know when it is turning. The collective consciousness of the beings inhabiting the world at the moment of transition does not have access to the perspective from which the turning is visible. That perspective requires standing outside the cycle. The view from the mountain that the ancient seers cultivated, not to be superior to the world they observed, but to be of use to it. To leave behind, encoded in texts precise enough to survive the dark age intact, what they saw from that height. For the people in the valley living inside something whose full dimensions they cannot see from where they are standing. The same text adds, the transition carries a specific grace, not the grace of rescue, not the grace of difficulty removed by an outside force, the grace of standing at the hinge of the cycle,
at the point where a single, genuine act of consciousness, one real moment of clarity, one authentic reaching toward the sacred against the full resistance of the age, carries a weight and a consequence that the same act in any other part of the cycle cannot quite achieve. Where the lever is shortest and the fulcrum is most precisely placed. Where the effort, if it is genuine, moves something much larger than the effort itself. You are at the hinge. The question is not whether you fully understand the dimensions of that position. The question is what you do with it. The Padma Purana closes its description of the Yuga transition with an image I want to leave you with tonight. It says, "Those who are close to the turning will feel two things simultaneously, often in the same moment, often in the same breath. The maximum weight of the age that is ending, the full accumulated gravity of everything Kali Yuga represents, the distance, the forgetting, the noise, the texture of living inside a world that has lost its sacred center and does not know how to find it. That weight will feel, at certain moments, more total than ever before, more inescapable, more like the definition of reality itself. And in that same moment, in the same breath, something else, something that has no adequate name in the vocabulary the Dark Age produced. A quality of presence, a sudden, brief, completely inexplicable sense of being accompanied, of something very large, very patient, and very close that has been there all along. These two feelings are not contradictions. They are the two faces of the threshold. The full darkness felt completely, and the first light felt just as completely, simultaneously, in the same human body, in the same breath. This is what it feels like to live at the turning of an age. And if any part of that description landed with the weight of recognition rather than the lighter weight of information, then you already know where you are standing, at the threshold, in the last hours before something that has been held for a very long time finally breaks open. What was left behind, and who can still access it? There is a question embedded in everything we have covered in this series. It has been there from the very first chapter, from the first moment we began tracing the arc of the gods' withdrawal, from the luminous, effortless, unremarkable contact of Satya Yuga, through the slow drift of the intermediate ages, through the precise prophecies of Kali, through the detailed portrait of Kalki and the transition that precedes his arrival, through the specific signs that the ancient seers encoded for the human beings who would be alive at this exact crossing point. The question is this: what did they leave behind? Not in the abstract, not in the philosophical sense of legacies and influences and the general cultural inheritance of a civilization that once existed and has since passed. Specifically, concretely, what did the gods, in the full awareness of what was coming, in the complete knowledge of how long the darkness would last and how thorough the forgetting would be, actually leave behind for the human beings who would live through that darkness? For the people who would be born into a world from which the sacred had withdrawn so completely that most of them would not even know what they were missing? Who would inhabit the absence without a word for it? Who would feel the distance without a map to what had once been close?
who would spend entire lifetimes searching for something they could not name because the culture they were born into had no name for it. The Vedic tradition answers this question precisely, completely. And the answer, when you sit with it fully, is one of the most extraordinary and most quietly devastating things in all of ancient literature. Because the answer is not that they left nothing. It is not that the Dark Age was an abandonment, a cutting of ties, a turning away, a withdrawal into indifference. The answer is almost the opposite of that. The answer is that they left everything. Everything a human being could ever need, in forms specifically chosen for their ability to survive the exact conditions of the age that was coming. Survive it and remain accessible, and wait. The answer begins with sound, not music, not language in the ordinary sense. Sound understood the way the tradition that produced the Vedas understood it, as the most fundamental medium of reality. Not as one phenomenon among others in the physical world, as the operating principle that underlies all phenomena, as the substance from which visible, tangible, measurable reality is crystallized, as the code from which the program of the cosmos is running. The Vedic understanding of sound, shabda in Sanskrit, is not a poetic metaphor dressed up in scientific-sounding language. It is a cosmological claim of the highest precision and the longest verification.
The universe, the tradition holds, did not begin with a physical event of condensing matter. It began with vibration, the primordial sound, the first differentiation of the undifferentiated Brahman into the world of form and distinction, from which all subsequent complexity emerged. The ancient traditions call it Nada Brahman, the divine sound, the note that the cosmos is continuously playing at a frequency so fundamental that the entire structure of material reality is its resonance. Everything you can see, touch, measure, and describe is that sound at the level of density at which it becomes visible to a perceptual system operating at the frequency of the human body. The gods, before they withdrew, left the Vedas, not as books. Books came later, a concession to the limitations of the Dark Age, a way of preserving in physical form what had originally existed only as sound, transmitted from mouth to ear, in the specific intimacy of the teacher-student relationship. The Vedas, in their primary form, are sequences of sound, specific, precise, extraordinarily complex sequences of syllables whose power lies not in their semantic meaning, but in their vibration, in the specific frequencies they produce when spoken correctly, in the specific effects those frequencies have on the consciousness of the beings who produce them and the beings who receive them, and the space in which they are spoken. This is why the Vedic tradition insists that the Vedas must be spoken aloud, why they were preserved for thousands of years through oral transmission rather than written text. Not because writing was unavailable, but because the written form captures only the semantic content, and the semantic content is not where the power lives. Why the training of a Vedic chanter takes years of meticulous, daily, embodied practice, not to memorize meanings, but to reproduce sounds with a precision that the tradition understands as functional, as operational, as producing effects in the real world that depend entirely on the accuracy of the sonic form. The way the effect of a surgical instrument depends on the precision of its edge. The gods left an instrument, a complex, extraordinarily precise instrument,
for maintaining the connection between the human world and the divine. Even in an age when the direct, effortless, natural connection had been severed. Even in an age when the membrane between the ordinary and the sacred had thickened to near opacity. Even when no one alive could remember what it can't like the lone, the not other of the world, and the difference control. Even when, no one moment being the same, even when the same field, the Vedas, are the key that still feeds the lock, even when the lock has been buried under centuries of forgetting, and the house it belongs to has been so long abandoned that most people passing by do not know there was ever a house there at all. Sound was not the only thing left behind. The tradition preserves within the vast body of the Puranas and the Tantras and the lineage teachings of the surviving Guru-Shishya traditions a second category of inheritance that is in some ways more directly accessible to the human beings of Kali Yuga than the Vedic texts themselves. It is the knowledge of the body, specifically the knowledge that the human body is not merely a biological organism subject to the processes of chemistry and physics and the gradual deterioration of organic systems. That it contains, within its physical structure, a complete and functional map of the cosmos. That the same energies that move through the universe, the same fundamental forces that the gods embody, each deity representing a specific quality and frequency of cosmic intelligence, also move through the human body continuously. Whether or not the person inhabiting the body is aware of this, whether or not the culture they were born into has any framework for understanding or working with it.
This knowledge, preserved in the tantric traditions, in the Hatha and Raja and Kundalini yoga traditions, in the specific lineages of practitioners who maintained it across the Dark Age with the same dedicated care that the Vedic chanters maintained the sacred sounds, is the most practically accessible gift the gods left behind. Because it does not require a world configured around the sacred to function. It does not require elaborate ritual infrastructure or the support of a culture organized around the divine as its central value. It requires a body, which every human being has, and a willingness to turn attention toward what that body actually is, not what the age has decided it is, not the reductive biological account that Kali Yuga's dominant mode of understanding offers, but what the tradition that predates Kali Yuga by thousands of years understood it to be, and transmitted that understanding across every generation, even the darkest ones. The Shiva Samhita, one of the classical texts of the Hatha Yoga tradition, describes this inheritance with a directness unusual even within a tradition not given to understatement. It says, "The entire cosmos is contained within the human form. Everything that exists in the macrocosm exists within the microcosm of the body. Every deity, every cosmic force, every quality of consciousness associated with every level of the divine hierarchy, all of it is present right now in the specific organism you are inhabiting. Not as dormant potential waiting to be activated through extraordinary practice over extraordinary spans of time, as actual, current, operational presence. The gods did not leave the world. They went into the world, into the most intimate possible form of the world, the form that every human being carries with them everywhere, at every moment,
as the most immediate and most personal dimension of their existence. They are in the breath, in the specific pattern of the breath,
in the way the body holds and releases, in the relationship between the movement of air and the movement of attention, and the specific quality of awareness that arises when both are brought into conscious, deliberate, sustained relationship with each other. This is not metaphor. The Shiva Samhita is making a claim about physical reality, about the actual mechanics of consciousness and its relationship to the biological systems of the human body. And that claim has been tested across thousands of years by millions of practitioners working in dozens of distinct lineages, in dozens of different cultural contexts, with dozens of different vocabularies for describing what they found, with results consistent enough, specific enough, and reproducible enough that the tradition preserved not just the claim, but the complete methodology, the precise techniques through which the claim can be personally verified by any human being willing to apply them with sufficient seriousness, sufficient time, and sufficient honesty about what they actually find. The third category of what was left behind is the most mysterious and the most debated within the tradition itself. The texts speak of Gupta Vidya, concealed knowledge, teachings so specific and so powerful that they were deliberately removed from general circulation before the Dark Age descended. Not destroyed, not lost, but hidden, placed in forms of preservation that the Dark Age could not accidentally uncover and could not deliberately destroy. Some of these are described as physical, teachings placed in locations so remote and so carefully chosen that the deterioration of the age could not reach them. The tradition of terma, hidden treasures, is most fully developed in the Tibetan Buddhist context, where specific teachings are said to have been hidden in rocks, in lakes, in the deep folds of mountains, to be discovered only when a specific type of practitioner arrives with the specific quality of inner readiness required to perceive what is there. But the Vedic tradition also speaks of hidden knowledge, of teachings held not in physical locations, but in the living memory of specific lineages, families and communities that maintained through every generation of the Dark Age knowledge whose full significance they may not themselves have completely understood, but that they preserved with the faithful, careful attention that belongs to people who know they are holding something on behalf of a future they cannot fully imagine, who chose, generation after generation, to preserve rather than to discard, to pass forward rather than to let go, to carry the lamp even when they could not see what it was illuminating, even when the surrounding culture offered no support for the carrying, even when the practical benefits of what they were preserving had long since become invisible, and the only reason to continue was the specific quality of faithfulness that the tradition had somehow instilled deeply enough to outlast every pressure of the age to let it go. And then there is the most personal category, the one that requires no lineage, no initiation, no external transmission of any kind. The Katha Upanishad, one of the most precisely constructed and most deeply loved of all the Upanishadic texts, contains a description of what was left behind that has no parallel in any other ancient literature. It says, "The divine is not far away. It is at the depth of what you are.
not as reassurance, as a precise cosmological description of the actual structure of a human being.
Atman, the awareness that underlies every experience without itself being any particular experience. The witness that is present in every moment of consciousness without being identical to any content of consciousness, is identical to Brahman, the ground of all existence, the undifferentiated consciousness from which the entire manifest universe has crystallized, and into which it will eventually dissolve. The innermost reality of the individual human being and the innermost reality of the cosmos are the same thing, encountered from two different directions, which means the divine, which appears to have withdrawn from the world, which appears from inside Kali Yuga to be absent, inaccessible, hidden behind a veil so thick that most people have stopped believing there is anything behind it, has not gone anywhere. It went to the one place no age can reach, no Yuga cycle can touch, no amount of cosmic forgetting can affect, no noise can drown out. Into the innermost nature of every human being alive. This is what the gods left behind. Not only outside, in texts and traditions, and the careful preservation of specific lineages through the dark centuries. Inside, at the core, in the structure of consciousness itself, in the awareness that is reading these words right now, in the attention that has been sustained through this entire story, because something in it recognized something, not as new information, as the specific, unmistakable quality of recognition that arises when something you have always known is finally said clearly enough to be consciously heard. The Mundaka Upanishad says, "The one who knows Brahman becomes Brahman," not approaches from a respectful distance, becomes. The boundary between the seeker and the sought dissolves, not because the seeker was elevated to the level of the divine, but because the boundary was never real, was a feature of the specific quality of consciousness produced by the conditions of the Dark Age. Was the fog calling itself the sky? And so we arrive at the answer to the question that has been present in this series from the beginning. Where did the gods go? They went into the world, into the sacred sounds, into the structure of the body, into the hidden lineages and the concealed knowledge and the specific quality of longing that arises in a human being at the bottom of the Dark Age, when the culture has provided every possible substitute for the real thing, and the person has tried enough of those substitutes to know that none of them is what they are actually hungry for. The gods went into that hunger, into the inarticulate, impossible to explain, impossible to dismiss ache that arises in certain human beings at the nadir of the forgetting, and that functions, for those who follow it honestly and completely, as the most reliable compass available for finding what was never truly lost. They left behind everything that anyone genuinely seeking will ever need to find them. The only question the tradition has always asked in every age and every form of its long transmission is the same question. Are you still listening? Because if you are,
Everything that was left behind is still here, and it has been waiting with absolute patience for exactly this quality of attention, for exactly this long. The answer that was always here. We began with a question, not a complicated question, not one that requires years of scholarship or decades of spiritual practice to understand. A simple question, the kind that a child might ask looking up at the night sky, with a specific quality of attention that children have before the world teaches them to stop looking. When will they come back? We have traveled a long way to reach the answer. Through the precise architecture of the Vedic cosmological timeline, the 4 yugas, the calculated descent, the specific date encoded in the positions of the planets on a specific morning 5,000 years ago, when the age changed with the departure of a single being. Through the signs, the precise, clinical, uncomfortable signs that the ancient seers listed with the calm of people describing a condition they had seen before, a condition they expected, a condition they left behind a complete description of, not to terrify, but to orient, so that the people living inside it would recognize it for what it was. A season, not the permanent state of reality, a season. Through the figure of Kalki, that white horse on the horizon, that principle of clarity arriving at the moment of maximum confusion, that specific quality of seeing that cuts through fog not by destroying it, but by making it visible for what it is. Through the transition itself, through what it actually feels like from the inside, through the two things felt simultaneously, the maximum weight and the first warmth, in the same breath, in the same body, at the same threshold, and through what was left behind, the sounds, the body, the hidden lineages, the hunger, the ache that cannot be filled by anything the Dark Age offers, and that therefore, for those who follow it honestly enough, long enough, far enough, functions as the most reliable compass available. Here is what I want you to take from all of this. Not the cosmological framework, though it is extraordinary. Not the specific prophecies, though they are precise enough to produce in any honest reader a specific quality of recognition that is difficult to dismiss. Not even the figure of Kalki, though the image of that white horse appearing on the horizon of a world that has forgotten horses like that exist, that image, if you let it arrive fully, carries something that stays.
What I want you to take is this. The ancient seers did not write these texts for themselves. They wrote them for you. For the specific human being who would be alive at this specific crossing point. Who would feel the weight of the age without knowing its name. Who would feel the absence of the sacred without knowing what was absent. Who would feel the hunger without knowing what would satisfy it. And who would, somehow, find their way to a story that named it all. That is not an accident. That is exactly what the texts were designed to do. To find the people who were ready. To arrive at the specific moment when the quality of a person seeking had developed enough to receive what the text was carrying. You are reading this because something in you recognized something. That recognition is not incidental. It is the thing itself. The Vedas end, not all of them, but the most intimate layer of them, the layer closest to the source, with a sound, not a word, not a teaching, not a doctrine or a prescription or a promise, a sound. Om. The sound that the tradition says contains all other sounds within it. The sound that the cosmos itself is making continuously, at the frequency that underlies every frequency. The sound that a human voice, shaping itself around that specific vibration, participates in, for the duration of its sounding, the deepest and most fundamental layer of what reality actually is. The ancient seers ended with this sound because they understood that everything they had said, everything contained in hundreds of thousands of verses, in thousands of years of transmission, in the entire vast architecture of the tradition they had built and maintained and passed forward through every generation of the descent, all of it was pointing toward a single, simple, direct, available, immediate experience that is here, right now, in this moment. In the quality of attention that a human being is capable of when they have become still enough, quiet enough, and honest enough about what they are actually seeking. Not in the future, not after Kali Yuga ends, not after Kalki arrives, not in the next Satya Yuga. Now. The gods will return. The texts are unanimous about this. The wheel turns. The long exhale completes itself. The inhale begins. The quality of the world, its luminosity, its responsiveness, its capacity to carry the sacred in the ordinary texture of daily life, returns. Not as it was exactly. Nothing returns exactly as it was, but recognizably, with the specific quality of aliveness that tells every conscious being that the source is near again, that morning comes. But here is what the tradition wants you to understand, and what we have been building toward across every chapter of this story. That morning is not separate from this moment. The light that will flood the new age is the same light that is present right now in the innermost nature of every human being alive. It has not dimmed. It has not been affected by the turning of the ages. It is not waiting for Kalki to arrive before it becomes available. It is available now, to anyone still enough to receive it, to anyone honest enough to stop filling the silence with substitutes and simply wait. In the specific quality of alert, open, undistracted waiting that the tradition calls the most essential spiritual practice of Kali Yuga. Not meditation exactly, not prayer exactly, not ritual. Listening. The kind of listening that does not already know what it is listening for. The kind that is genuinely open to being surprised by what arrives when the noise has been set down. Even briefly, even imperfectly, even in the 5 minutes before sleep, when the day has finally exhausted its claim on your attention, and the silence begins, quietly, to offer something the day could not. You were born into a broken age, but you were also born into the age closest to the turning. The seers who mapped this cycle were not ultimately describing a tragedy. They were describing a breath, a very long, very deep, very necessary breath. the kind that can only be completed by someone willing to feel the full weight of the exhale before the inhale becomes possible. That willingness, that specific quality of conscious presence at the bottom of the held breath, is what this age requires. And it is what this age uniquely makes possible. The gods have not forgotten us. The divine has not gone silent. The light at the depth has not dimmed. It is where it has always been, waiting for the quality of stillness that can finally, after all this time, reach it. Go gently into your rest tonight. The question has always been alive, and so still is the answer.